On a hilltop in the Hudson Valley, 25 miles north of Manhattan, stands a house that changed America. From the outside, Kykuit looks almost modest. 40 rooms of weathered stone. No gold leaf, no marble columns. A visitor might mistake it for a prosperous gentleman's country retreat. But the man who built this house controlled more wealth than any American before or since. Adjusted for inflation, his fortune exceeded $400 billion. He owned 90% of the oil in the United States. Presidents feared him. Newspapers called him a monster. Political cartoons depicted his company as an octopus strangling the nation. His name was John D. Rockefeller. The family that lived in this house was once the most hated in America. Workers died in their mines. Competitors were crushed without mercy. A journalist dedicated years of her life to exposing their crimes. The Supreme Court itself ordered their empire destroyed. Within 2 generations, the Rockefeller name became synonymous not with greed, but with generosity. The family that built Standard Oil also built the United Nations headquarters. They created the University of Chicago, restored Colonial Williamsburg, and founded the Museum of Modern Art. Their charitable giving exceeded anything the world had ever seen. 4 generations of Rockefellers called Kykuit home. The old man who made the fortune, the son who gave it away, the grandson who became vice president of the United States, and the great-grandsons who turned this private estate into a public trust. One of them died in scandal. Several sought the presidency. All of them gathered here in this house on the hill, where the views stretch for miles and the family secret stayed hidden for decades. This is the story of how oil money built an American dynasty, how that dynasty nearly destroyed itself, and how a house called Lookout became the monument to one of the most remarkable transformations in American history. Subscribe now if you enjoy these stories, and let's dive into it. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Tithed His First Dollar. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in the small town of Richford, New York. The house was modest. The family was not wealthy. Nothing about his birth suggested the fortune that would follow. His father was a problem. William Avery Rockefeller called himself a doctor, but he had no medical training. He traveled the countryside selling patent medicines and elixirs that promised to cure cancer. The locals called him Devil Bill, and the nickname was earned. He was a con artist, a gambler, and eventually a bigamist who maintained a second family under an assumed name in another state. Devil Bill would disappear for months at a time, leaving his wife and children to manage on their own. When he returned, there was sometimes money. Often there was not. The family moved frequently, always one step ahead of creditors or scandal. John's mother provided the counterbalance. Eliza Davison Rockefeller was a devout Baptist who believed in discipline, thrift, and the obligations of faith. She taught her children to work hard, to save carefully, and to give 10% of everything they earned to the church. This practice of tithing was not optional in her household. It was the foundation of moral life. Young John absorbed both influences. From his father, he learned that the world was full of opportunities for those clever enough to seize them. From his mother, he learned that wealth without principle was worthless. These 2 lessons would shape everything that followed. The family settled near Cleveland, Ohio in 1853. John was 14 years old. The city was growing rapidly, fed by railroads and industry and the commerce of the Great Lakes. Cleveland in the 1850s was a place where a determined young man could build something from nothing. John finished high school but did not attend college. He took a brief course in bookkeeping and set out to find work. For weeks, he walked the streets of Cleveland, visiting every business he could find, asking for employment. Most turned him away. He was young, thin, and utterly unremarkable in appearance. On September 26, 1855, a commission merchant named Hewitt and Tuttle finally offered him a position as assistant bookkeeper. His salary was 50 cents per day. John Rockefeller celebrated that date for the rest of his life. He called it Job Day and marked its anniversary every year with more devotion than his own birthday. Decades later, as one of the richest men on earth, he would still pause on September 26th to remember the moment his working life began. His first task was recording transactions in the company ledger. He counted every penny that passed through the firm. He checked every calculation twice. He found errors that others had missed. His employers noticed his precision. From his very first paycheck, John set aside 10% for charity. His mother's training held firm. He gave to his Baptist church, to missionary societies, to the poor. He recorded every donation in a small notebook, just as carefully as he recorded his business transactions. Giving was not generosity to him, it was obligation. He lived frugally. He walked to work rather than pay for transportation. He brought his lunch rather than buy a meal. Every cent that did not go to charity went into savings. By the end of his first year, he had accumulated enough money to make a small loan to a neighboring farmer. The farmer paid interest. John recorded the payment and reinvested it. This was the pattern that would define his life. Earn methodically, save relentlessly, give systematically, compound everything. His employers promoted him. His salary increased. He continued living as though he were still making 50 cents per day. By 1858, at 19 years old, he had saved enough to form a partnership with a friend named Maurice Clark. They established a commission business trading grain, hay, and other goods. The timing was fortunate. The following year, 1859, a man named Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania oil boom was about to transform American industry, and John D. Rockefeller, the bookkeeper who counted every penny and tithed every paycheck, was about to transform himself. He had no interest in drilling for oil. The wildcatters who sank wells were gamblers, and gambling was his father's vice. But refining oil into kerosene for lamps, shipping it efficiently, selling it reliably, that was a business a methodical man could master. The boy who tithed his first dollar was about to become the richest man in the world. Chapter 2. Black Gold. On August 27, 1859, a former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. His well produced 25 barrels per day. Within months, thousands of prospectors flooded into the Pennsylvania hills, sinking wells wherever they could find land. The American oil boom had begun. The timing aligned perfectly with industrial need. Whale oil was becoming scarce and expensive. Factories required lubrication for their machines. Homes needed light after dark. Kerosene refined from petroleum could provide all of this at a fraction of the cost. But the oil fields were chaos. Prospectors drilled wherever they pleased. When a well came in, they had no way to store the oil. Wooden barrels overflowed, crude petroleum soaked into the ground. Prices swung wildly from $10 a barrel to 10 cents depending on supply. Fortunes were made and lost in weeks. The men who drilled for oil were gamblers betting everything on holes in the ground. John D. Rockefeller watched this frenzy and saw something different. The drillers were taking all the risk. They spent their money sinking wells that might produce nothing. When they did strike oil, they had no choice but to sell to whoever would buy. The real opportunity was not in the ground. It was in what happened after the oil came out. Refining crude oil into usable kerosene required equipment, expertise, and capital. Shipping the refined product to customers required relationships with railroads. Selling it required distribution networks. A man who controlled refining could let the wildcatters take the risks while he collected steady profits from processing their crude. In 1863, Rockefeller and his partner Maurice Clark invested $4,000 in a Cleveland refinery operated by a chemist named Samuel Andrews. The facility was small but efficient. Andrews understood the technical process of turning crude petroleum into clean, burning kerosene. Rockefeller understood everything else. Cleveland was ideally positioned for the refining business. The city sat at the intersection of multiple railroad lines. Lake Erie provided water transportation to eastern markets. Crude oil could be shipped in from Pennsylvania cheaply, and refined kerosene could be shipped out even more cheaply. Geography favored Cleveland, and Rockefeller intended to exploit that advantage completely. He studied every aspect of the operation. He calculated the cost of each barrel of crude, each hour of labor, each mile of transportation. He visited other refineries to learn their methods. He negotiated with suppliers to reduce the price of barrels and chemicals. Where other refiners saw a business, Rockefeller saw a system that could be optimized. His partnership with Clark became strained. Clark was content with modest profits. Rockefeller wanted to expand aggressively, reinvesting every dollar into growth. In 1865, the partners agreed to resolve their differences through auction. Whoever bid highest would buy out the other. The auction took place on February 2nd. Clark opened with $500. Rockefeller bid higher. Clark raised again. The bidding continued for hours, climbing far beyond what either man had expected. Finally, at $72,500, Clark stopped. Rockefeller had won. It was an enormous sum. Rockefeller had to borrow heavily to pay it. But he now controlled the largest refinery in Cleveland, and Cleveland was becoming the refining capital of America. He found a new partner in Henry Flagler, a grain merchant with capital to invest and a talent for negotiation. Together they expanded relentlessly. They bought a second refinery, then a third. They purchased their own barrels rather than buying from suppliers. They acquired wagons to transport their product. Every function that could be brought in-house was brought in-house. Flagler negotiated with the railroads for volume discounts. If Standard Oil guaranteed to ship 60 carloads of kerosene per day, the railroad would charge less per barrel than it charged competitors who shipped smaller quantities. This was legal and common practice. It was also devastating to smaller refiners who could not match the volume. On January 10, 1870, Rockefeller incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. The founding partners included his brother William, Henry Flagler, Samuel Andrews, and several other investors. Rockefeller held the largest share. The company was capitalized at $1 million. The name was deliberate. Standard Oil promised a standardized product of consistent quality. Customers could trust that every barrel of standard kerosene would burn the same way. In an industry plagued by adulterated fuel and inconsistent refining, this reliability became a powerful selling point. Within 2 years, Standard Oil controlled nearly every refinery in Cleveland. The method was simple and ruthless. Rockefeller would approach a competitor and offer to buy their operation. He would show them his books, demonstrating that Standard Oil's costs were lower than theirs. He would explain that Standard's railroad discounts made competition impossible. The competitor could sell now at a fair price, or they could watch their business collapse and sell later for nothing. Most sold. Those who refused found themselves squeezed from every direction. Standard Oil cut prices in their markets until the competitor bled money. Railroads mysteriously raised shipping rates for non-standard oil. Suppliers became difficult to find. The holdouts eventually surrendered or went bankrupt. Rockefeller did not see this as cruelty. He saw it as efficiency. The oil industry was wasteful and chaotic. Too many small refiners produced inconsistent products at irregular intervals. Consolidation would eliminate waste, stabilize prices, and benefit everyone. The competitors he absorbed were not victims. They were obstacles to rational organization. He expressed this philosophy bluntly. Competition, he believed, was inefficient. It drove companies to undercut each other until everyone lost money. Cooperation under unified management was better for business, better for workers, and better for customers. One phrase attributed to him captured his view completely. Competition is a sin. By 1872, Standard Oil refined 25% of all American oil. The company was growing faster than any business in the country. Rockefeller was 32 years old, already wealthy, and just beginning to understand how much power he could accumulate. The oil fields of Pennsylvania still produced chaos. Wells came in and dried up unpredictably. Prospectors still gambled their savings on holes in the ground. But the chaos now flowed through Cleveland, through Standard Oil, through the methodical hands of John D. Rockefeller. He was building something that had never existed in American business. Not just a company, but an empire. Not just wealth, but control. The bookkeeper who counted every penny was about to become the octopus that strangled a nation. Chapter 3. The Octopus. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of all oil refining in the United States. No single company had ever dominated an American industry so completely, and John D. Rockefeller was not finished. The conquest had taken less than a decade. After consolidating Cleveland, Rockefeller turned to the refineries of Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York. The pattern he had perfected now spread nationwide. Every major refining center faced the same choice: join Standard Oil or be crushed by it. Some competitors joined willingly. They received Standard Oil stock in exchange for their operations and became wealthy as the company grew. Others fought back and were systematically destroyed. Standard cut prices in their markets until they bled cash. Suppliers refused to sell them barrels. Railroads charged them higher rates. Banks declined to extend credit. The press began to notice. Journalists documented the pattern of acquisitions and the complaints of ruined businessmen. Editorial cartoons appeared depicting Standard Oil as a giant octopus, its tentacles wrapped around railroads, banks, state legislatures, and the United States Capitol itself. Rockefeller ignored the criticism. He believed he was bringing order to chaos. The oil industry before Standard had been wasteful and unstable. Now it was efficient. Prices for consumers had fallen. Quality had improved. Employment was steady. If competitors suffered, that was the price of progress. The legal structure of his empire required innovation. State laws in the 1870s made it difficult for a corporation chartered in one state to own property or conduct business in another. Standard Oil of Ohio could not legally own refineries in Pennsylvania or New York. Rockefeller needed a mechanism to control dozens of separate companies across multiple states while maintaining unified management. His lawyers devised a solution. In 1882, they created the Standard Oil Trust. Shareholders of 40 affiliated companies transferred their stock to a board of 9 trustees. In exchange, they received trust certificates that entitled them to dividends. The trustees, led by Rockefeller, now controlled all 40 companies as a single coordinated enterprise. The arrangement was unprecedented. No American business had ever operated at this scale or with this degree of centralized control. The trust became a model that other industries quickly copied. Sugar, whiskey, cotton oil, and lead all formed trusts in imitation of Standard Oil. Headquarters moved to a nondescript building at 26 Broadway in Lower Manhattan. The address became synonymous with corporate power. From this location, Rockefeller and his trustees directed an empire that spanned the continent. The numbers were staggering. Standard Oil controlled thousands of domestic wells. Thousands of miles of pipeline carried crude oil to refineries and refined products to markets. Tank cars by the thousands moved petroleum by rail. An army of workers drew wages from the company and its affiliates. Annual revenues exceeded those of most state governments. Rockefeller's personal wealth grew beyond comprehension. His fortune was measured in tens of millions and climbing every year. At a time when the average American worker earned less than $500 annually, Rockefeller's income from dividends alone exceeded what most families would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. He lived modestly by the standards of his wealth. He did not build marble palaces on Fifth Avenue like the Vanderbilts. He did not host lavish parties or collect European art. His pleasures were simple: golf, gardening, Sunday church services, time with his wife and children at their country estate in New York. This restraint was strategic as well as temperamental. Rockefeller understood that ostentatious display invited scrutiny. The less visible he remained, the more freely he could operate. He rarely gave interviews. He declined invitations to public events. He let his lawyers and subordinates handle reporters while he focused on business. But invisibility could not last forever. The scale of Standard Oil made it impossible to ignore. Competitors who had been crushed filed lawsuits. State attorneys general launched investigations. Congressional committees demanded testimony. The word monopoly entered common vocabulary, and Standard Oil was its primary example. Rockefeller testified before government bodies with careful precision. He answered questions narrowly. He expressed confusion at complicated inquiries. He remembered few details about specific transactions. His demeanor was calm, polite, and utterly unrevealing. Critics called him evasive. Defenders called him private. Both were correct. The New York World summarized public sentiment in 1880. It called Standard Oil the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country. The description was partisan, but not entirely unfair. Rockefeller had built his empire by eliminating alternatives. Customers who wanted kerosene bought from Standard Oil because there was no one else to buy from. The trust structure itself attracted legal challenges. In 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that the Standard Oil Trust violated state law and ordered its dissolution. Rockefeller complied technically by dissolving the trust and distributing its assets to 20 separate companies. The dissolution changed nothing. The same men who had served as trustees now served as directors of the successor companies. Interlocking boards ensured coordinated management. The companies operated as a unified enterprise under different legal names. Standard Oil interests, as the arrangement came to be called, functioned exactly as the trust had functioned. Rockefeller turned 60 in 1900. He had largely withdrawn from daily management, leaving operations to trusted subordinates like John Dustin Archbold. His health was fragile. A digestive condition had left him unable to eat most foods. His hair had fallen out from alopecia, giving him the gaunt appearance that would define his public image. He spent more time at his estate in Pocantico Hills, overlooking the Hudson River. He played golf daily, often alone. He handed out dimes to children he encountered, a habit that newspapers mocked as cheap charity from a billionaire. But his empire remained intact. Standard Oil still dominated American refining and controlled a vast share of world oil exports. Its refineries processed petroleum from multiple continents. Its tanker ships crossed every ocean. The trust had been dissolved in name only, and a woman in Pennsylvania was already writing the words that would finally bring it down. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Exposed Him. She grew up watching her father lose everything. Ida Minerva Tarbell was born in 1857 in Erie County, Pennsylvania, at the edge of the oil regions. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, was a craftsman who built wooden tanks to store crude petroleum. When the oil boom arrived, he saw opportunity. He invested in storage facilities, then in production. For a time, the family prospered. Then Standard Oil arrived. The Tarbells watched as independent producers were squeezed out of business one by one, railroad rates that competitors could not match, prices that dropped below the cost of production, buyers who mysteriously refused to purchase non-Standard Oil. Franklin Tarbell's partner committed suicide. Franklin himself was left with the man's debts. The family survived, but Ida never forgot what she had witnessed. She became a teacher, then a writer. She moved to Paris to study and began contributing articles to American magazines. Her work was careful, researched, and readable. Editors noticed her talent for making complex subjects accessible to general audiences. In 1894, she joined the staff of McClure's magazine in New York. The publication was part of a new movement in American journalism. Its editors believed that deeply reported stories about business and politics could attract readers while serving the public interest. They called it muckraking, a term meant as an insult but worn as a badge of honor. Tarbell had already written successful biographical series on Napoleon and Abraham Lincoln. Her editor, Samuel McClure, wanted something bigger. He wanted an investigation into the most powerful corporation in America, Standard Oil. Tarbell accepted the assignment with personal as well as professional motivation. She remembered her father's ruin. She remembered the fear that had spread through the oil regions when Standard Oil expanded. Now she would document exactly how Rockefeller had built his empire. The research took nearly 2 years. She read thousands of pages of court records, legislative testimony, and corporate documents. She interviewed former employees, ruined competitors, and industry observers. She traced the history of every major acquisition and mapped the connections between Standard Oil's dozens of subsidiary companies. Her most valuable source was unexpected. Henry H. Rogers was a senior executive at Standard Oil, one of Rockefeller's closest associates. Mark Twain, a friend of Rogers, arranged the introduction. For reasons that remain unclear, Rogers agreed to meet with Tarbell regularly and answer her questions. Some historians believe he wanted to shape the narrative. Others suggest he harbored resentments against Rockefeller. Whatever his motivation, Rogers provided inside information that no outsider could have obtained. The first installment appeared in McClure's magazine in November 1902. The title was simple: The History of the Standard Oil Company. Readers were transfixed. Tarbell wrote with precision and restraint. She did not call Rockefeller a criminal. She simply documented what he had done. The railroad rebates that destroyed competitors, the secret ownership of supposedly independent companies, the industrial espionage that revealed rivals' plans, the systematic campaign to eliminate anyone who stood in Standard Oil's path. She quoted from court testimony and corporate records. She named names and cited dates. She built her case, fact by fact, chapter by chapter, until the pattern was undeniable. The series ran for 19 installments over 2 years. Each month, readers waited for the next chapter. Circulation at McClure's soared. Other publications began their own investigations into corporate misconduct. The age of investigative journalism had begun. Rockefeller refused to respond publicly. His advisors urged him to defend himself, but he believed that dignified silence was the appropriate response to undignified attacks. He referred to Tarbell privately as Miss Tarbell and that poison woman. He never granted her an interview. His silence only amplified her impact. In 1904, the series was published as a book. The history of the Standard Oil Company ran to over 800 pages in 2 volumes. It became an immediate bestseller and remains in print today. Historians consider it one of the founding works of investigative journalism and a primary catalyst for the antitrust movement. Tarbell had done something that legislators and prosecutors had failed to accomplish. She had turned public opinion decisively against Standard Oil. The corporation that had seemed invincible now seemed corrupt. The man who had built it now seemed villainous. She was not without critics. Defenders of Rockefeller argued that she ignored his charitable giving and his role in lowering oil prices for consumers. They noted that her father's failure might have colored her judgment. They accused her of sensationalism disguised as scholarship. Tarbell rejected these criticisms. She had documented facts. If the facts made Rockefeller look bad, that was not her fault. She had given him every opportunity to respond, and he had declined. The public could draw its own conclusions. The conclusions were devastating. Politicians who had hesitated to challenge Standard Oil now found courage. State attorneys general filed new lawsuits. Federal prosecutors began building a case under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Roosevelt administration made trust-busting a centerpiece of its domestic agenda. Tarbell had provided the evidence. Now the government would act. She continued writing for decades, covering other industries and social issues. She never lost her reputation as the woman who had taken on Rockefeller and won. When she died in 1944 at age 86, obituaries remembered her primarily for the Standard Oil investigation. Rockefeller outlived most of his critics. He died in 1937 at age 97, still one of the richest men in the world, still convinced that he had done more good than harm. But Ida Tarbell had written the first draft of history, and her version proved more durable than his. Chapter 5. The Fall of Standard Oil. The government finally moved in 1906. President Theodore Roosevelt had built his reputation on challenging corporate power. His administration had already targeted the railroad monopolies and the meatpacking industry. Now federal prosecutors turned their attention to the largest corporation in America. The case was filed in Missouri, where Standard Oil had significant operations. The charge was straightforward: violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The government alleged that Standard Oil had conspired to restrain trade, eliminate competition, and maintain an illegal monopoly over the petroleum industry. Standard Oil's lawyers dismissed the case as political theater. They argued that the company had achieved its dominance through superior efficiency, not illegal practices. They pointed to falling oil prices as evidence that consumers had benefited from consolidation. They insisted that size alone did not constitute a crime. The trial lasted for months. More than 400 witnesses testified. The government introduced thousands of documents detailing Standard Oil's business practices over 4 decades. Prosecutors documented the pattern of secret deals, predatory tactics, and systematic elimination of competitors that Ida Tarbell had exposed in her magazine series. Rockefeller himself was called to testify. He was 67 years old, long retired from active management, but still the largest shareholder. His testimony was a masterpiece of evasion. He claimed faulty memory on crucial points. He deflected questions with references to subordinates who had handled the details. He presented himself as a simple businessman who had built a company through hard work and sound principles. The prosecutors were not impressed. They had the documents. In November 1909, the federal court ruled against Standard Oil. The company was found guilty of monopolizing the petroleum industry through illegal means. The court ordered the dissolution of the trust into its component parts. Standard Oil appealed to the Supreme Court. The case reached the highest court in the land in 1910. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White presided over the arguments. The stakes could not have been higher. This would be the most significant antitrust ruling in American history, establishing precedents that would shape corporate law for generations. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict. Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The monopoly was illegal. The corporation must be dissolved. Chief Justice White wrote the majority opinion. He introduced what became known as the rule of reason, arguing that not every restraint of trade was illegal, only unreasonable ones. Standard Oil's practices, he concluded, were unreasonable by any measure. The pattern of predatory behavior was too consistent, too systematic, and too damaging to competition to be justified. The court gave Standard Oil 6 months to reorganize. The dissolution created 34 separate companies from what had been a unified empire. Standard Oil of New Jersey became the largest successor, eventually renamed Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. The list continued through dozens of regional and specialized entities. On paper, the monopoly was destroyed. The octopus had been carved into pieces. In reality, the situation was more complicated. The same shareholders who had owned Standard Oil stock now owned shares in 34 different companies. Rockefeller remained the largest individual shareholder in most of them. The executives who had managed the unified corporation often continued managing its fragments. The breakup created competition on paper while preserving much of the old structure in practice. And then something unexpected happened. The stock prices of the successor companies began to rise. Investors who had feared the dissolution discovered that the separate companies were worth more than the unified whole. The parts, freed from the legal troubles that had plagued the parent, attracted new investment and expanded into new markets. Rockefeller watched his fortune grow. Before the breakup, his Standard Oil holdings were worth approximately $300 million. Within 2 years, the combined value of his shares in the successor companies exceeded $900 million. The Supreme Court had made him richer than ever. He was now wealthier than he had ever been. The irony was not lost on observers. The great antitrust crusade, the years of investigation and litigation, the landmark Supreme Court ruling, had ended by tripling the fortune of the man it was meant to punish. Rockefeller had lost control of a monopoly and gained a diversified portfolio worth 3 times as much. He never expressed public satisfaction at this outcome. He continued his retirement routine of golf and quiet living. He continued his philanthropy, donating millions to universities and medical research. He watched from a distance as the oil industry he had created continued to transform the world. The Standard Oil case established the template for American antitrust enforcement. Future monopolies would be measured against the precedent it set. The rule of reason became the standard for evaluating corporate behavior. The dissolution, however imperfect, demonstrated that even the largest corporations could be held accountable. But the man who built the monopoly emerged unscathed. Rockefeller lived another 26 years after the Supreme Court ruling. He saw automobiles replace horses, creating demand for gasoline that dwarfed the kerosene market he had originally dominated. He watched his successor companies grow into global giants. He remained, until the end, the man whose fortune only grew larger with each attempt to diminish it. The government had destroyed his monopoly. It had only multiplied his wealth. Chapter 6. Blood in the Snow. The money came with blood on it. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was about to learn this lesson in the most public way imaginable. By 1914, the old man had largely withdrawn from business. His son, known as Junior, managed the family's vast investments from their New York headquarters. Among those investments was a controlling stake in the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, one of the largest coal mining operations in the American West. Junior had never visited the mines. He knew the company only through financial reports and correspondence with its executives. The miners who extracted coal from the Colorado mountains existed for him as abstractions, line items in a ledger. Those miners lived a different reality. Colorado's coal mines were among the most dangerous in the nation, with a death rate more than double the national average. Men worked underground for wages that barely covered expenses at company stores where they were required to shop. They lived in company towns where they were required to rent. They were paid by the ton, but the company weighed tons at 2,200 pounds instead of the standard 2,000. Safety improvements cost money and earned nothing, so the companies ignored them. In September 1913, 9,000 miners walked off the job. They demanded enforcement of state mining laws, the right to choose their own housing and doctors, and recognition of the United Mine Workers of America. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company refused to negotiate. Instead, they evicted striking miners and their families from company housing. With nowhere else to go, the workers established tent colonies on the open prairie. The largest camp, near a railroad depot called Ludlow, housed roughly 1,200 men, women, and children through the brutal Colorado winter. Junior received reports from company executives assuring him that outside agitators had caused the trouble. The miners themselves, he was told, were satisfied with their conditions. He believed these reports. In testimony before Congress, he declared that he would support his managers at any cost, even if it meant the destruction of the company. It nearly meant the destruction of his family's reputation. On the morning of April 20th, 1914, the Colorado National Guard moved against the Ludlow camp. Many guardsmen were company employees in uniform, paid with company money. They brought machine guns. What happened next remains disputed in its details, but devastating in its outcome. Gunfire erupted, and the tent colony caught fire. Families who had dug pits beneath their tents for protection huddled underground as flames spread above them. By nightfall, approximately 20 people were dead, including women and children who had suffocated in a pit beneath a burning tent. The nation recoiled in horror. Newspapers that had dismissed the strikers as troublemakers now published photographs of the charred camp and the bodies pulled from the ashes. The deaths at Ludlow transformed a labor dispute into a massacre, and the blame fell squarely on the Rockefeller family. Protesters gathered outside company offices in Manhattan. Picketers marched in front of the Rockefeller estate in Tarrytown. Socialist writer Upton Sinclair led demonstrations and wrote furious condemnations. The violence in Colorado continued for 10 days after Ludlow, as enraged miners attacked company property across a 200-mile front, burning buildings and fighting running battles with guards and militia. President Woodrow Wilson finally sent federal troops to restore order on April 29th. The strike collapsed in December, with none of the workers' demands met. But the damage to the Rockefeller name proved more lasting than the strike itself. Junior was called to testify before the United States Commission on Industrial Relations in January 1915. The chairman, Frank Walsh, questioned him relentlessly. Had he known about conditions in the mines? Had he approved the use of militia against the strikers? Did he accept responsibility for the deaths? Rockefeller's answers satisfied no one. He claimed ignorance of specific conditions and deferred to his managers. When Walsh showed him a photograph of a child killed at Ludlow, Rockefeller refused to look at it. Something had to change. Junior hired Ivy Lee, a pioneer in the emerging field of public relations. Lee's advice was radical for its time. Stop hiding. Rockefeller should go to Colorado personally, meet the miners, listen to their grievances, and let photographers capture it all. In September 1915, Junior did exactly that. He toured the mines, ate in the workers' dining halls, and danced with miners' wives at a social gathering. He asked questions and appeared to listen to the answers. The newspapers covered every moment. It was a performance, but it was also something more. The experience genuinely affected Junior. He implemented a company union plan that gave workers limited representation, the first such arrangement in American heavy industry. Critics dismissed it as a hollow gesture designed to prevent real unionization. But it marked the beginning of a transformation. The father had built the fortune through methods that invited investigation and prosecution. The son would learn to protect it through philanthropy and public relations. The Ludlow massacre taught Junior that wealth carried obligations, and ignoring them meant disaster. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make the Rockefeller name mean something other than blood and money. The results of that effort would reshape the American landscape. Chapter 7. Building the Lookout. While lawyers fought over his empire and journalists cataloged his sins, John D. Rockefeller was building a house. The Dutch settlers who first farmed this land in Westchester County had called the hilltop Kykuit, meaning lookout. From its summit, you could see the Hudson River curving south toward Manhattan, the Palisades rising on the opposite shore, and miles of rolling countryside in every direction. Rockefeller purchased the property in 1893, drawn by the same views that had named the place centuries earlier. He already owned a house on the land, but it burned in 1902. The fire forced a decision he had been postponing. Now approaching 70, Rockefeller would build something permanent. He delegated the project to his only son, Junior, who hired the architectural firm of Delano and Aldrich. Chester Aldrich was a distant relative of Junior's wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, and both architects had trained at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Construction began in 1905. The original design called for a 3-story stone mansion with a steep roof, something substantial but not ostentatious. Rockefeller had always preferred simplicity over display. He dressed plainly, lived modestly by the standards of his fortune, and distrusted the elaborate mansions that his fellow industrialists were erecting along Fifth Avenue and in Newport. But the first version of Kykuit disappointed him. The service entrance sat directly below the primary bedroom window, which meant that every delivery truck announced itself to anyone trying to sleep. The chimneys drew poorly, filling rooms with smoke that damaged walls and furniture. The third-floor bedrooms were cramped under the steep roof, leaving inadequate space for guests. The house looked impressive from a distance, but functioned poorly up close. Junior brought in William Wells Bosworth, a landscape architect who had been designing the grounds, to oversee a complete reconstruction. Bosworth raised and flattened the roof, added a 4th floor for staff, and constructed a service tunnel beneath the approach road so that deliveries could arrive unseen and unheard. He replaced the original facade with locally quarried fieldstone and Indiana limestone, transforming the house into a 4-story Beaux-Arts villa that balanced classical formality with the rustic setting. The reconstruction took another 5 years. Kykuit was finally completed in 1913. Rockefeller was 74 years old when he moved in. He had outlived most of his critics and many of his competitors. The fortune that had made him infamous continued growing despite every legal and journalistic assault. Now he had a house worthy of the view, set on a hilltop where he could survey his domain like the Dutch settlers who had named it. The interior reflected restraint as much as wealth. Ogden Codman Jr., who had co-authored an influential book on decoration with novelist Edith Wharton, designed rooms that avoided the cluttered opulence fashionable among the rich. There was no ballroom, no grand staircase meant to impress visitors. The furnishings were elegant but not overwhelming. Chinese ceramics and European antiques filled the spaces without crowding them. Portraits of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington hung on the walls, reflecting the historical legacy Rockefeller admired. Outside, Bosworth created gardens that rivaled the house itself. Terraces descended the hillside in geometric precision, punctuated by fountains, pavilions, and classical sculpture. The Oceanus fountain, commissioned as a replica of a 16th-century Italian original from the Boboli Gardens in Florence, commanded the forecourt. Paths wound through formal plantings toward a Japanese garden, an Italian garden, and a temple dedicated to Aphrodite. The grounds were designed for contemplation, not entertainment. Rockefeller walked these gardens daily when his health permitted. He had given up active management of his business interests years earlier. Golf occupied his mornings. Afternoons brought visitors, correspondence, and the quiet rhythms of retirement. He was building something else now, a network of charitable foundations and educational institutions meant to transform his reputation from predator to philanthropist. His wife Laura, known to the family as Seti, died at Kykuit in March 1915 after more than 50 years of marriage. She had stood beside him through every scandal and every triumph, managing their household while he managed his empire. Her death marked the beginning of his final decades. Rockefeller spent his remaining years at Kykuit, finally dying in 1937. Junior inherited the estate and made it his primary residence, raising his own family where his father had retreated from the world. After Junior's death in 1960, his son Nelson took possession and filled the grounds with modern sculpture that would have bewildered the original builder. Picasso tapestries, works by Henry Moore and Alexander Calder, transformed the classical gardens into an outdoor museum of 20th century art. 4 generations of Rockefellers called Kykuit home. The house that began as one man's refuge became a family seat, then a museum, and finally a monument to an era of American wealth that has never been repeated. The name still means lookout. The view still stretches to the river and beyond. What it overlooks has changed. The oil industry that built the fortune now faces its own reckoning with history. The family that once controlled it has dispersed across continents and generations. But the house remains on its hilltop, maintained precisely as it was designed, a permanent record of what one fortune could build when building was the point. Chapter 8. Redemption. The son who would save the family name nearly destroyed himself trying to earn his father's approval. John Davison Rockefeller Jr. was born in Cleveland on January 29, 1874, the only boy among 5 children. Where his father possessed an instinctive genius for accumulating wealth, Jr. found the business world exhausting. After graduating from Brown University in 1897, he joined his father's operations in Manhattan, hoping to prove himself worthy of the Rockefeller legacy. He failed. The pressure of trying to match his father's achievements while carrying the weight of public hatred for the family name proved too much. In 1904, Jr. suffered a complete nervous breakdown. He retreated from business entirely, spending months recovering from what his doctors called exhaustion of the nerves. That collapse would prove to be the making of him. When Junior returned to work, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Rather than try to become a captain of industry like his father, he would become something else entirely. He would give the fortune away. In 1901, he married Abby Aldrich, daughter of Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. She brought warmth and cultural sophistication to his rigid, devout existence. Together, they would have 6 children who would extend the family's influence across American politics, business, and culture for generations to come. But first, Junior had to survive Colorado. The catastrophe at the mining camps left him publicly reviled, accused of having blood on his hands. He had not ordered the attack, but he had ignored warnings about conditions in the mines. The guilt would shape everything that followed. His response was not to retreat into silence, but to transform himself into something his critics could never have predicted. Working with the advisors he had assembled during the crisis, Junior developed a new philosophy. Wealth, he came to believe, carried obligations. Every right implied a responsibility. Every possession demanded a duty. He began to act on these principles with a determination that eventually eclipsed even his father's generosity. In 1926, a minister named William Goodwin approached Junior with an audacious proposal. Goodwin wanted to restore the colonial capital of Virginia, Williamsburg, to its 18th century appearance. He had approached Henry Ford first, but Ford declined. Junior was intrigued. The project began modestly. Junior authorized the secret purchase of a few historic properties, communicating with Goodwin through coded telegrams signed David's father to prevent local landowners from raising their prices. But the modest project grew into an obsession. Over the following decades, Junior would pour more than $60 million into colonial Williamsburg, restoring and reconstructing an entire colonial town. He visited twice yearly, personally supervising details down to the placement of individual bricks. The Great Depression tested whether his commitment to giving was genuine. In 1930, as unemployment reached catastrophic levels, Junior broke ground on the most ambitious private construction project in American history. Rockefeller Center rose from the heart of Manhattan during the darkest economic years the nation had ever known, employing between 40 and 60,000 workers when nearly everyone else was laying them off. Construction crews worked through the Depression, building 14 Art Deco towers that would become synonymous with New York itself. 64% of construction workers in the city had no jobs. Junior provided them. His philanthropy extended far beyond buildings. When efforts to establish Great Smoky Mountains National Park stalled for lack of funding, Junior donated $5 million in 1927 to complete the land purchases, honoring his mother's memory. He had never visited the mountains. He simply believed they should be preserved. The same impulse led him to donate over 32,000 acres to Grand Teton National Park, fund museums at Mesa Verde and Yellowstone, and save 15,000 acres of sugar pines at Yosemite from commercial logging. The National Park Service estimates his conservation donations totaled the equivalent of $800 million in current value. In 1972, Congress honored his contributions by naming a memorial parkway between Yellowstone and Grand Teton in his honor. His most consequential gift came as the Second World War ended. The newly formed United Nations needed a permanent home. The organization was considering locations in Europe or elsewhere when Junior intervened. He purchased 17 acres along Manhattan's East River for $8.5 million and donated the land to the international body. His gift kept the United Nations in America and cemented New York's role as the diplomatic capital of the world. By the end of his life, Junior had given away more than $537 million. Combined with his father's charitable contributions of $540 million, the first two generations of Rockefellers directed over $1 billion to causes they believed would benefit humanity. No American family had ever given so much. The shy, anxious son who suffered a breakdown at 30 had become the greatest philanthropist of his age. He outlived his father by more than 2 decades, spending his final years moving between the Hudson Valley estate and the Arizona desert. Abby had preceded him by 12 years, but the children they raised together would carry the family's work into a new century. Junior never stopped believing that his father was the greater man. At a ceremony honoring his contributions to Virginia, he departed from his prepared remarks to say, with emotion in his voice, how he wished his father could have been there. "I am only the son," he said. But it was the son who redeemed the family name. Chapter 9. 4 Generations. The house that John D. Rockefeller built for himself became a monument to the dynasty he created. 4 generations of the family would call Kykuit home. Each left their mark on the estate, transforming what began as one man's hilltop retreat into a repository of American wealth, power, and artistic ambition that has no equal in the nation. The founder spent his final decades at Kykuit in quiet routine. He rose early, read his Bible, played golf on his private course, and distributed dimes to visitors who came hoping to glimpse the richest man in America. His tastes remained simple even as his fortune grew beyond comprehension. He wanted comfort, not grandeur. His son wanted something more. Junior inherited Kykuit after his father's passing and immediately began reshaping it to reflect his own vision. Where Senior had been content with functional elegance, Junior filled the house with Chinese ceramics from the Han, Tang, Ming, and Qing dynasties. He collected English furniture, French carpets, and portraits of American founders. The interiors designed by Ogden Codman became showcases for treasures accumulated across decades of careful acquisition. But it was Junior's own son who would transform Kykuit most dramatically. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1908, the third of 6 children. Where his father was reserved and methodical, Nelson burned with ambition. He inherited his mother Abby's passion for modern art and her gift for connecting with people. He also inherited her conviction that art belonged not in museums alone, but in the places where people actually lived. When Nelson took possession of Kykuit after Junior's passing, he set about making the estate a living gallery of 20th century masterworks. He started in the basement. The service passages and storage rooms beneath the mansion became an underground museum filled with paintings by Picasso, Chagall, Matisse, Kandinsky, Pollock, and Warhol. One corridor displayed Picasso tapestries that Nelson had commissioned between 1955 and 1974, each one woven by hand in southern France with the artist's personal approval. The tapestries translated some of Picasso's most celebrated paintings into fabric, including works from Nelson's own collection and others borrowed from the Museum of Modern Art. Then Nelson turned to the gardens. Over the following 2 decades, he added more than 70 works of modern sculpture to the grounds his grandfather had landscaped. Works by Henry Moore, Alexander Calder, Louise Nevelson, Aristide Maillol, David Smith, and Isamu Noguchi appeared among the classical fountains and formal terraces. Some pieces arrived by helicopter, lowered onto the lawns because no road could accommodate their size. Nelson possessed an extraordinary eye for placement. Each sculpture found its perfect setting against the Hudson Valley landscape, the formal geometry of the gardens providing counterpoint to the abstract forms of the art. Calder's large spiny, 17.5 feet wide, commanded the edge of the golf course. Moore's knife-edge 2-piece presided over the main terrace. A Giacometti greeted visitors at the entrance alongside Brancusi's Grand Oiseau, poised like a bird about to take flight. The juxtaposition was deliberate and profound. Nelson understood that the tension between his grandfather's classical gardens and his own modernist collection would create something neither could achieve alone. His public career matched his private ambitions. Elected governor of New York in 1958, Nelson served 4 consecutive terms, the first governor in the nation's history to achieve that distinction. He expanded the state university system, created the Council on the Arts, and oversaw massive building projects that reshaped Albany and Manhattan. 3 times he sought the Republican presidential nomination. 3 times he failed. In 1974, President Gerald Ford appointed him vice president, making Nelson the second person to reach that office through appointment rather than election. He resigned as vice president in 1977 and returned to his art. 2 years later, on January 26, 1979, he died of a heart attack in Manhattan. He was 70 years old. In his will, Nelson bequeathed his share of Kykuit to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. His brothers Lawrence and David eventually did the same. The youngest brother, David, became the family patriarch after Nelson's death, guiding Rockefeller interests from his position as chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. He lived until 2017, reaching the age of 101, the last survivor of his generation. David's death marked the end of an era. The 6 children of Junior had directed their inherited billions toward causes ranging from conservation to banking, from politics to the arts. Nelson became vice president. Winthrop became governor of Arkansas. John III devoted himself to philanthropy. Lawrence championed environmental preservation. The only daughter, Abby, lived quietly on the estate. Today, more than 270 members of the Rockefeller family gather twice yearly at the Playhouse on the Pocantico estate. The fortune that Senior accumulated has been dispersed across trusts and foundations, no longer concentrated in a few hands. But Kykuit remains, preserved exactly as 4 generations shaped it. The house contains multitudes: Senior's modest bedroom, Junior's Chinese porcelains, Abby's Tang Dynasty Bodhisattva, Nelson's Picasso tapestries, and his children's collection of colored bottles, excavated from old farm sites on the property, and arranged in a cabinet with curatorial precision. The National Trust offers tours from May through November. Visitors walk through rooms where presidents and kings once gathered, past sculptures worth millions, across gardens designed to frame views of the river below. They see how wealth can corrupt and how it can create, how a fortune built on monopoly was transformed into institutions that shaped American medicine, education, conservation, and art. The lookout still commands its view of the Hudson. The family that built it proved that dynasties can endure, that names synonymous with greed can become synonymous with generosity, and that 4 generations of careful stewardship can preserve what one generation's ruthlessness created. Chapter 10. The Rockefeller Legacy. The fortune built on oil would reshape medicine, education, and art across the globe. When John D. Rockefeller began giving away his money in earnest, he did not simply write checks to worthy causes. He created institutions designed to operate in perpetuity, foundations that would continue their work long after he was gone. The approach was methodical, scientific, and unprecedented in scale. It would define American philanthropy for the next century. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, became the vehicle through which the family would change the world. Its mission was breathtaking in ambition, to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Within decades, it would become the largest philanthropic enterprise on Earth. The Foundation's first major campaign targeted a disease that had crippled the American South for generations. Hookworm infected millions of rural Southerners, leaving them anemic, weak, and unable to work productively. The parasite entered through bare feet, burrowed into the intestines, and drained its victims of energy and ambition. Northern observers blamed the South's poverty on laziness. The truth was parasitic. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission launched its campaign against hookworm in 1909. Teams of doctors traveled to rural communities, tested residents, provided treatment, and educated families about sanitation. The campaign proved that hookworm could be eliminated through simple public health measures. More importantly, it demonstrated that systematic intervention could transform entire regions. By 1914, the Foundation had expanded its hookworm campaigns to 52 countries across 6 continents. The success of these efforts provided a template for attacking other diseases. Yellow fever came next. The Foundation committed half its international health budget to eliminating yellow fever, a disease that killed thousands each year across Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. 6 researchers funded by the Foundation died in the field pursuing a vaccine. Their sacrifice was not in vain. In 1935, Foundation scientists developed the first effective vaccine against the disease. Max Theiler, the microbiologist who led the breakthrough, received the Nobel Prize in 1951. The Foundation's impact on medical education proved equally profound. Working with Abraham Flexner, whose 1910 report had exposed the sorry state of American medical schools, the Rockefellers funded a complete transformation of how doctors were trained. They established the first schools of public health at Johns Hopkins in 1918 and Harvard in 1921. They modernized medical training across the globe, spending $25 million to introduce public health programs at scores of universities. In China, the Foundation created the China Medical Board, which introduced modern medical practices to a nation of 400 million people. The Foundation built Peking Union Medical College, training generations of physicians who would transform healthcare across Asia. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901, became one of the world's premier biomedical institutions. It produced discoveries that earned its scientists 23 Nobel Prizes. In 1965, it became Rockefeller University, expanding its mission to include graduate education. But the family's philanthropy extended far beyond medicine. The General Education Board, established in 1903, funded the construction of hundreds of high schools throughout the South, trained teachers for African American communities, and modernized agricultural practices across the region. The board helped lift the South from chronic poverty into the 20th century. Rockefeller's gift of $36 million over 25 years built the University of Chicago virtually from scratch, transforming it within a decade into one of the world's leading research institutions. The university's economics department would produce more Nobel laureates than any other, shaping global economic policy for generations. While her husband funded medical research and historic preservation, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller pursued a different passion. In 1929, Abby joined with two friends, Lily Bliss and Mary Quinn Sullivan, to found the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The three women believed America needed an institution dedicated exclusively to the art of their time. They opened just days after the stock market crash in rented rooms on Fifth Avenue with an exhibition of Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Seurat. The public response was overwhelming. Within 10 years, the museum moved into its permanent home on 53rd Street, on land that had once held the Rockefeller family townhouse. The Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Sculpture Garden, designed by Philip Johnson, became one of the most celebrated outdoor spaces in the city. Abby's son Nelson served as the museum's first president beginning in 1939. Her youngest son David joined the board in 1948 and remained associated with the institution until his death nearly 7 decades later. The family's patronage of modern art extended from the galleries of Manhattan to the gardens of Kykuit, where Nelson's collection of Picassos and Calders transformed his grandfather's estate into an outdoor museum. The scale of Rockefeller giving defies easy comprehension. The first 2 generations alone contributed more than $1 billion to charitable causes. The Rockefeller Foundation distributed more foreign aid than the entire United States government for decades. The Green Revolution, funded in part by the foundation, may have saved 1 billion lives by dramatically increasing agricultural yields across the developing world. The fortune that Ida Tarbell had exposed as the product of ruthless monopoly became the instrument of unprecedented generosity. The name that had once symbolized corporate greed became synonymous with philanthropy itself. The transformation was not accidental. It was the deliberate work of a family that understood how money could corrupt and how it might be redeemed. Chapter 11. The Lookout Today. The shuttle bus climbs the winding road through forests that have barely changed since the first Rockefeller arrived. Visitors to Kykuit begin their journey at Phillipsburg Manor in Sleepy Hollow, a restored Dutch colonial farm that the family helped preserve decades ago. From there, they board buses that wind through the estate's outer roads, passing stone walls built by workers a century ago, mature trees that Senior himself transplanted, and glimpses of the Hudson River that drew the family to this hilltop in the first place. The estate opened to the public in 1994, 15 years after Nelson Rockefeller bequeathed his share to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. His brothers Lawrence and David followed with their own gifts. Today, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund maintains the property, while historic Hudson Valley operates the tours that bring thousands of visitors each season. 3 types of tours are offered from May through November. The Selected Highlights tour runs 90 minutes and covers the main floor of the house, the inner garden, and the west terrace. The Classic tour extends to 2 hours, adding the underground galleries with their Picasso tapestries and the sculpture-filled grounds. The Grand Tour takes visitors even deeper into the estate's treasures. What strikes most visitors first is the modesty of the house itself. 40 rooms sounds impressive until you consider that Senior was worth more than the federal government when he lived here. He could have built a palace to rival any in Europe. Instead, he chose a home that emphasizes views over grandeur, comfort over ostentation. The fieldstone walls and Indiana limestone trim blend into the landscape rather than dominating it. There is no grand entrance designed to intimidate visitors. The scale is human. Inside, the rooms are arranged for living rather than display. Ogden Codman's interiors feel elegant, but not oppressive. Chinese ceramics from dynasties spanning 2,000 years line the shelves. English furniture fills the drawing rooms. Portraits of American founders share wall space with family photographs. The effect is of a home where extremely wealthy people actually lived, not a museum assembled for public consumption. The contrast with the basement galleries is deliberate and jarring. Beneath the classical formality of the main floors, Nelson created an underground world of 20th century art. The passages that once led servants to their duties now display paintings by Picasso, Chagall, Matisse, Kandinsky, Pollock, and Warhol. One corridor is devoted entirely to Picasso tapestries, enormous woven translations of the artist's most celebrated paintings, commissioned by Nelson over 2 decades, and approved by Picasso himself. Outside, the sculpture collection transforms the gardens into an open-air museum unlike any other in America. More than 70 works by the masters of modern sculpture dot the grounds. A Giacometti greets visitors at the entrance. Moore's knife-edge 2-piece presides over the main terrace. Calder's large Spiny commands the edge of the golf course. Brancusi, Nevelson, Mayol, and Smith appear among the fountains and hedges that Bosworth designed for Nelson's grandfather. The juxtaposition creates a conversation across generations. The formal Beaux Arts gardens, with their classical fountains and geometric terraces, provide the perfect foil for abstract forms that Senior would have found incomprehensible. Nelson understood this tension and exploited it brilliantly. The coach barn houses a collection of antique carriages and vintage automobiles that trace the evolution of transportation across the family's tenure. Horse-drawn vehicles that carried Senior to church share space with the sleek machines that his great-grandchildren drove. The building itself, completed in 1913, is 3 times the size of the main house. The Japanese garden, conceived by Bosworth in 1908 and refined over decades, combines elements of several traditional styles. A 1962 tea house designed by the Japanese architect Junzo Yoshimura stands beside pools and waterfalls that would not seem out of place in Kyoto. The garden represents yet another layer of the family's collecting impulse, another aesthetic absorbed and made their own. Just down the hill from the estate stands the Union Church of Pocantico Hills. The small stone church, built in 1921 with Rockefeller money, appears from outside to be nothing remarkable. Inside, it contains one of the most unexpected treasures of modern art in America. Henri Matisse's Rose Window, his final work, glows in shades of yellow, green, and blue above the altar. The artist completed its design just 2 days before his death in 1954. It honors Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, who championed modern art when her husband still preferred Chinese porcelains. 9 windows by Marc Chagall surround the sanctuary. The largest, depicting the Good Samaritan, memorializes Junior. Its deep blues saturate the space with color. The other 8 windows, depicting Hebrew prophets and cherubim, were added over the following years to create what Chagall called a more harmonious environment. The congregation had initially resisted the modern designs. The Rockefellers, as always, prevailed. Beyond the formal estate, the family has given much of their land to public use. The Rockefeller State Park Preserve encompasses hundreds of acres of forests and meadows open to hikers, joggers, and horseback riders. Bill Clinton, who lives nearby in Chappaqua, has taken regular runs along its trails. Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture occupies another portion of the original property, teaching sustainable farming to a new generation. The tours end where they began, with buses returning visitors to Phillipsburg Manor. Most leave with photographs of the Hudson Valley vistas and memories of art worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Some leave with questions about what it means to possess such wealth and what obligations come with it. The family that built Kykuit understood that question better than most. They answered it by giving most of what they had away. Chapter 12. The Meaning of Kykuit. The story of Kykuit forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How do we judge a family whose fortune was built on practices that crushed competitors, exploited workers, and triggered violence that killed women and children? And yet whose philanthropy eradicated diseases, educated millions, and created institutions that continue improving lives more than a century later? The answer may be that both judgments are correct. John D. Rockefeller earned the label robber baron. The term itself derives from medieval German lords who charged illegal tolls on roads crossing their lands, Critics applied it to industrialists who amassed wealth through questionable means. Rockefeller fit the definition. He built a monopoly that controlled 90% of American oil refining. He drove competitors to ruin. He benefited from labor practices that valued profits over human welfare. But Rockefeller also transformed American philanthropy. Before his era, the wealthy typically gave to churches and local causes. Rockefeller introduced what historian Waldemar Nielsen called scientific philanthropy. Rather than treating symptoms, he attacked root causes. Rather than feeding the hungry, he funded agricultural research that prevented hunger. Rather than building one hospital, he trained generations of physicians and researchers. The results speak for themselves. 23 Nobel laureates from Rockefeller University alone. A yellow fever vaccine developed by foundation-funded researchers. Hookworm eliminated across 6 continents. The Green Revolution that potentially saved 1 billion lives from starvation. Perhaps the most striking comparison is with another family whose story you may already know. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 with a fortune exceeding the entire United States Treasury. His son William doubled it within 8 years. Yet when 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University in 1973 for the first family reunion, not a single millionaire sat among them. The Rockefellers built their fortune during the same era. John D. died in 1937, worth approximately $1.4 billion. Today, more than 200 family members share an estimated $10 billion. 7 generations have passed. The wealth endures. The difference was not luck or market timing. It was planning. Cornelius Vanderbilt's deathbed advice to his son was simply, keep the money together. He left no structure to make this possible. The Rockefellers created an institution. Room 5600 at Rockefeller Center became the nerve center of a financial empire with 5 divisions overseeing investments, venture capital, family businesses, insurance, and risk management. Family trusts established in 1934 and 1952 protected assets from taxation and mismanagement. Professional managers were hired to oversee holdings. Philanthropy was organized to reflect shared values. Most importantly, the Rockefellers instilled purpose across generations. The Vanderbilts built mansions designed to impress society. The Rockefellers built institutions designed to outlast the family itself. Consider the physical evidence. Dozens of Vanderbilt mansions have been demolished, converted to museums, or sold to strangers. The breaker survives only because it was gifted to a preservation society. Marble House serves as a tourist attraction. Biltmore remains in family hands, but operates as a commercial enterprise. Kykuit tells a different story. The family still gathers at the Playhouse twice yearly. The estate's maintenance is funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Historic Hudson Valley operates tours, but the family retains its connection to the land their great-great-grandfather chose more than a century ago. This continuity reflects the advice Frederick Gates, Rockefeller's philanthropic advisor, once offered. The best philanthropy, he said, is constantly in search of finalities, a search for cause, an attempt to cure evils at their source. The Rockefellers applied this philosophy not only to giving, but to family governance itself. Critics argue that such arrangements perpetuate inequality, that billionaire philanthropy allows the wealthy to shape society according to their preferences rather than democratic processes. That foundation's named after robber barons launder reputations built on exploitation. These criticisms contain truth. The power to decide which universities receive funding, which diseases warrant research, which art fills museum walls belongs to those who accumulated fortunes through means that would be illegal today. Yet the alternative is not obvious. Government programs rise and fall with political winds. Commercial enterprises serve shareholders rather than society. The Rockefeller Foundation has pursued its mission continuously for more than a century, adapting to new challenges while maintaining focus on human welfare. Perhaps the most honest assessment comes from Rockefeller himself. He once wrote that the best philanthropy involves research, that knowledge has to be gained before intelligent giving can be accomplished. He practiced this throughout his life. Whether funding universities or eradicating diseases, he demanded measurable outcomes and evidence-based approaches. This mindset distinguished the Rockefellers from their Gilded Age peers. While other fortunes were squandered on yachts and parties and mansions that became too expensive to maintain, the Rockefellers treated wealth as a responsibility. Each generation was expected not merely to preserve the fortune, but to deploy it for purposes beyond personal consumption. Standing at Kykuit today, looking out over the Hudson toward the Palisades that Junior protected from development, visitors see the physical manifestation of this philosophy. The gardens remain immaculate. The art collection continues growing. The family still walks these paths. Whether this constitutes redemption depends on how one weighs the scales of history. The suffering caused by monopoly capitalism cannot be erased by philanthropy. The families devastated by Ludlow cannot be consoled by university endowments. The competitors driven to bankruptcy gained nothing from hookworm eradication. And yet, children today receive vaccines developed with Rockefeller funding. Students study at universities Rockefeller endowed. Researchers work in laboratories Rockefeller built. The very concept of strategic philanthropy, of giving design to multiply impact rather than merely distribute wealth, originated in the mind of a man born in a modest farmhouse in upstate New York. Kykuit embodies this contradiction. It is simultaneously a monument to Gilded Age excess and a testament to generational responsibility. A reminder of how wealth was accumulated in 19th century America, and an example of how it might be preserved and deployed for broader benefit. The lookout that gave this estate its name offers a view that stretches for miles in every direction. John D. Rockefeller chose this spot because he could see what others could not. That quality defined his career. He saw opportunity in chaos, order in the unruly oil industry, possibility in philanthropy when others saw only charity. His descendants continue looking from this hillside. What they see today differs from what their ancestors saw, but the view itself remains. That continuity, more than any dollar figure, may be the true Rockefeller legacy,